It began, as so many quiet horrors do, with something small, an object that had been waiting to be found. The basement of the Museum of English Life in York was a place of perpetual dusk, where the hum of the dehumidifiers was constant and the air smelled faintly of dust and varnish. Dr. Alice Grayson, senior archivist, was working late that February evening, surrounded by stacks of unlabeled crates. The lights overhead flickered softly, casting shifting shadows over century-old artifacts, lace collars, hand-tinted cartes de visite, crumbling letters sealed in wax that had long lost its shine. Her task was routine, cataloging donations from the recent clearance of an estate belonging to Dr. Lionel Mercer, a rural physician who had practiced in Norfolk between 1880 and 1910. The estate had yielded boxes of medical journals, handwritten prescriptions, and family paraphernalia, mundane items, mostly. But one box, wrapped in decaying linen, had no catalog tag. Alice pulled it toward her. Inside, amid dried lavender and scraps of yellowed newspaper, lay a leather-bound photograph album, its cover cracked, its spine mottled with age. The latch was rusted, but still intact. She hesitated before opening it. The smell that escaped was one she would later struggle to describe, not just the scent of old paper, but something faintly organic, faintly wrong. Like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The album's first pages were typical of the late Victorian domestic style. Small portraits of families seated stiffly in gardens, christening photos, even a few images of pets posed like little people. The script beneath each was delicate, written in brown ink that had begun to feather. But midway through the album, one photograph caught her attention. It was slightly larger than the others and mounted unevenly, as though it had been trimmed with scissors. It depicted 6 children standing against a coarse brick wall. 5 were upright, arranged in a line. The 6th, a small girl, was seated in front of them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The caption, written in the same spidery handwriting, read, "Eldridge family, Norfolk, 1899, 6 children." At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The children wore their best clothes, starched collars, buttoned boots, ribbons tied at neat angles. Their faces bore the familiar stillness of the age, the look of children told to hold perfectly still during the long seconds of an exposure. But as Alice leaned closer beneath the desk lamp, something in the composition made her pause. The 5 standing children cast faint shadows against the wall behind them. The seated girl did not. Her posture seemed unnaturally rigid, her chin slightly lifted, her eyes half shut. One small hand appeared to rest not on her lap, but on something just out of frame, something metallic that caught a faint glint of light. Alice frowned and adjusted the magnifier. The girl's hair was smoothed perfectly, her dress immaculate, but too large, perhaps borrowed. And the light on her face came from the wrong direction, illuminating her from the left, while every other child was lit from the right. She checked the back of the photograph. The paper stock was thick, matte, with a faint studio stamp barely legible through the dust. J. Corvin and Sons, Mortuary Portraiture, Norwich. Alice's pulse quickened. She knew that name. Corvin and Sons had been a short-lived photographic firm at the turn of the century, known for a particular kind of commission, post-mortem photography. In the Victorian age, such images had been both common and sentimental, a family's last attempt to preserve the likeness of a loved one. Parents would pose their deceased child as if merely asleep, surrounded by flowers or siblings in mourning clothes. It was macabre by modern standards, but in its time, it was an act of devotion. And yet, this image was different. There were no mourning symbols. No black veils. No floral tributes. The children were dressed not in grief, but in normal Sunday attire. It wasn't a farewell, it was a performance. Alice turned the page and found that the next photograph in the sequence was missing, its imprint still faintly visible in the paper where the adhesive had lifted. The remaining images resumed normally, depicting the same family months or years later. But there was no mention, no further record, of the seated girl. She closed the album slowly, the echo of the cover's clasp sounding far too loud in the empty archive room. As she sat in the half-light, the realization settled coldly in her chest. This photograph, this quiet, forgotten print, wasn't just another relic of Victorian mourning. It was something else entirely. A record of someone who wasn't supposed to exist. The following morning, Alice brought the album upstairs to the museum's photographic conservation lab. Sunlight filtered weakly through the high windows, illuminating the motes of dust that hung like faint ghosts in the air. The technician on duty, Naomi Briggs, a quiet woman with a steady hand and a skeptical mind, raised an eyebrow as Alice set the album on the counter. "Found something odd?" she asked, slipping on her cotton gloves. "Something off," Alice said. "It's probably nothing, but I'd like a high-resolution scan. The light doesn't match, and one of the children." She hesitated. How could she explain it? That a photograph nearly 130 years old had unsettled her in a way no image ever had? Naomi nodded and carefully placed the print beneath the scanner's plate. The hum of the machine filled the silence as the beam passed over the faded sepia surface. The result appeared on the monitor, slowly resolving into uncanny clarity. At first glance, the image seemed merely old, creased, blurred at the edges, grainy from time. But as Naomi zoomed in, the imperfections sharpened into something more deliberate. The small girl at the front, the sixth child, looked frozen not in the way of long exposure, but in the way of something that could no longer move. Her neck held too straight, her shoulders unnaturally squared. The skin of her face seemed almost waxen beneath the artificial light. "Is that a posing stand?" Naomi asked softly, tracing her gloved finger along the faint metal line that extended behind the child's shoulder. Alice leaned closer. There was a thin iron support, the kind used by 19th-century photographers to keep their subjects still during long exposure times. But in this case, it wasn't supporting posture, it was propping her up. "She's dead," Alice whispered before she realized she'd said it aloud. Naomi glanced at her sharply, but didn't argue. Instead, she zoomed out again, studying the rest of the children. Their eyes all faced the lens, yet none of them seemed to see it. Their expressions were flat, distant. The eldest boy's jaw was tight, his hands hidden behind his back. One girl, perhaps 7 or 8, stared slightly to the side, her lips pressed together as though fighting tears. And yet the composition itself was too precise, too deliberate. There was no grief, no sense of farewell. Alice had studied hundreds of post-mortem photographs from the Victorian period. In most, the affection was visible. The living often cradled the dead, sometimes gently touching the face or clasping the hands. There was tenderness in those images, a quiet defiance against loss. But here, none of the children touched the seated girl. Not even a hand brushed her shoulder. It was as if they were forbidden to. Naomi adjusted the exposure to reveal the darker background. Behind the children, the brick wall came into sharper relief, mottled with soot and faint white streaks. And in the upper right corner, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was the suggestion of a handprint, smudged, uneven, as though someone had pressed against the wall during the photograph. "Do you see that?" Alice asked, her throat dry. "Yeah," Naomi murmured. "But it's not part of the composition. It's behind them." The two women stared at the screen for a long moment before Naomi quietly saved the scan to the system under the label. Eldridge_1899_unverified origin.tif. Alice thanked her and took the original print, now sealed in a protective sleeve. As she turned to leave, Naomi called after her, "You know, sometimes people misidentify these. Maybe it's not a death portrait at all, maybe the kid was just sick, or fell asleep mid-exposure." Alice wanted to agree. She wanted to believe it. But as she descended the staircase back to the archives, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. The stillness of that little girl, the impossible light, the faint suggestion of metal glinting behind her head. She pulled out the museum's catalog record for the Mercer donation, hoping for context. Most entries listed generic items, medical texts, patient journals, correspondence, but at the very end of the index, one note stood out. Item 47, Family Photograph Album. Contents uncertain. Possibly related to local practice in Norfolk. Included per executor's instruction. That was all. No mention of the Eldridges, no donor note, no reason the album had been preserved. Alice logged the photo's metadata into the system but found herself lingering over the caption again. Eldridge family, Norfolk, 1899, 6 children. The ink was faint but steady, written by someone who had intended the words to be remembered. But why 6? The name Eldridge nagged at her memory. She'd seen it somewhere before, perhaps in one of the census ledgers or parish archives from her previous cataloging projects. She opened her laptop and began to search the museum's internal database. Within minutes, she found a partial match: Thomas and Martha Eldridge, residents of the Norfolk parish of Downmere in 1899. They had 5 children. She closed her eyes and exhaled. The photograph, it seemed, had 1 child too many. And that realization, quiet and logical as it was, made her skin crawl. Because it meant that somewhere between the taking of that photograph and its arrival in Dr. Mercer's possession, someone had decided that the truth of the 6th child was a truth that should be buried. But like so many things left to rot in the dark, it hadn't stayed buried for long. That night, Alice couldn't sleep. The image of the 6th child lingered behind her eyelids whenever she closed them, the pale oval of her face, the unnatural stillness of her hands. She had spent years among the dead, cataloging their remnants, their words, their photographs. But this was different. The album didn't just preserve memory. It distorted it. At 2:47 a.m., she gave up on sleep. Wrapped in her dressing gown, she returned to her laptop and reopened the museum's digital archive. The database flickered under the cold glow of the screen. She searched again for Eldridge, narrowing it by date and county. After several false leads, one document caught her attention. Coroner's Report, Downmere Parish, 1899. Case number 1442. Subject: female child, unidentified. Found deceased near the Eldridge residence, October 17, 1899. The record had no first name, only the terse summary of a Victorian clerk's inked report. Cause of death: exposure and shock. Body appeared recently washed and clothed in garments not her own. Approximate age: 6 to 8 years. Eyes closed post-mortem. Noted absence of rigor. Possible displacement post-mortem. Witness accounts inconclusive. Alice's stomach tightened. The date, October 1899, matched the notation in the album. And though the report never explicitly connected the girl to the Eldridge family, the proximity and timing were impossible to ignore. She dug deeper. The parish census for that year listed Thomas and Martha Eldridge, their occupations marked farmer and midwife, with 5 children: Henry, 12, Clara, 10, Edith, 8, Samuel, 6, and Beatrice, 4. Always 5. But then she found something stranger. In the 1901 census, only 4 names remained. Samuel was gone. No death record, no burial entry, no notation in the family's church register. Just absence. She printed the report, the paper trembling faintly between her fingers. Somewhere in those numbers and omissions was a shape she didn't yet recognize. A shadow left where a child should have been. The next morning, Alice presented her findings to the museum's historian, Dr. Jonathan Hale, an expert in rural Victorian culture. Hale was genial, absent-minded, and, much to Alice's frustration, rarely alarmed by anything. When she placed the printout of the photograph beside the coroner's report on his cluttered desk, he adjusted his glasses and frowned. "Well," he said after a long silence, "it's certainly unusual. But you know how these old records are. Misfiled, incomplete, sometimes written from rumor." "The dates match," Alice said. "The location matches. And the girl in the photograph, she's not one of the 5 listed children." He leaned forward, studying the image. The missing child could be a cousin, a neighbor. Or perhaps it's a photographic composite. Those were common in late Victorian portraiture. The studio could have added an absent family member, even posthumously. But this wasn't added afterward, Alice insisted. She was there. Look at the shadows. The stand behind her. It's a mortuary photograph, but there's no mourning, no black crepe, no indication of death. Dr. Hale pursed his lips. "Corvin and Sons, you said? Norwich? I've read about them. Their records were lost in a studio fire in 1900. Some of their surviving images were questionable, experimental. They had this theory that spirit photography wasn't fraudulent but psychological, that the dead might leave impressions on film if the emotional conditions were right. Alice's skin prickled. Impressions? Residual manifestations? Hale said absently. They believed certain subjects could act as conduits. The photograph as both record and invitation. He smiled faintly, unaware of how cold the word invitation sounded. That evening, back in the archive, Alice retrieved the album once more. She turned the pages carefully, half expecting the missing photograph to have returned, as if it had been playing some quiet trick. But the blank imprint remained, a ghost-shaped void on the paper. She ran her gloved finger along the edge of the missing photos page. There, embedded in the brittle adhesive, was something almost invisible, a strand of hair, pale and fine, caught beneath the paper fibers. She held it under the light. It shimmered faintly, not white, not blonde, but a color between them, like the threads of old silk. Without thinking, she whispered, "Who were you?" The silence in the room felt heavier afterward. The air seemed to thicken, as if the archive itself was listening. She closed the album. The clasp clicked shut with an oddly final sound. Later, when she passed through the dim corridor toward the staff exit, the lights flickered again, once, twice, and then steadied. But for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the faint reflection of 6 small figures in the glass case beside her. Only 5 remained when she looked back. The scan of the Eldridge photograph had been archived, catalogued, and safely stored. But Alice couldn't stay away from it. Every night that week, long after the other staff had gone home, she would sit alone in the dim blue light of her office, staring at the digital image on her monitor. The more she studied it, the more it seemed to change, not overtly, not in any way she could prove, but subtly, like something alive adjusting itself when not being watched. On the 4th night, she noticed it, a faint shift in the grain of the wall behind the children. A pattern she had assumed was brick dust now seemed to form a series of marks, as though someone had scratched at the surface of the wall from within the photograph itself. She adjusted the resolution, zoomed in. The marks weren't random. They were letters. Faint, crude, and almost lost to time, but unmistakable once seen. For shallow strokes that formed a word, stay. Alice's breath caught. She leaned closer, checking the file metadata to make sure she hadn't accidentally opened an edited copy. No, this was the original scan, untouched since Naomi had saved it. And yet the marks hadn't been visible before. She blinked hard, heart thudding. When she looked again, the word was gone. That night she dreamt of the photograph. Not the paper itself, but the scene within it. The children stood in their perfect line, the brick walls stretching endlessly behind them. The small girl at the front sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and when Alice looked closer, she realized that the girl's eyes, closed in the photo, were open now. They were staring directly at her. When she woke, it was still dark, and her phone screen glowed faintly on the nightstand. The time read 3:03 a.m. A single new notification blinked at the top. Image file modified, Eldridge_1899_unverified origin.tif. She stared at it, her throat tightening. That file was stored on the museum's closed internal network. No one outside the building could access it remotely. No one. By morning, she was back at the museum before sunrise. The building's corridors were silent, the motion sensor lights flickering awake as she passed. She logged into her workstation and opened the file. It had changed again. The photograph was grainier now. The tonal contrast deepened as if the exposure had lengthened in her absence. The background bricks seemed darker, almost wet. And there, behind the children, barely perceptible, was a shape that hadn't been there before. At first she thought it was shadow. But the longer she stared, the clearer it became. A figure, indistinct, standing at the far left edge of the frame, half-cropped by the border. Its head was bowed. Its hands, pale and thin, reached forward as though to touch the shoulder of the eldest boy, but stopped just short. Alice felt her mouth go dry. She printed a copy of the image and carried it straight to Naomi in the conservation lab. Naomi squinted at it, shaking her head. "I didn't touch the file." I haven't even opened it since last week. She compared the print to the original scans stored on the lab server. To Alice's horror, both versions were now identical, same distortion, same shadowed figure. Could it be damage? Alice asked. Chemical degradation, maybe? Some kind of artifact. Naomi frowned. Digital files don't degrade like that. Not unless something rewrites them. Or, she hesitated, unless something's being added. They exchanged a long, silent look. Then Naomi forced a laugh, brittle and unconvincing. It's just a glitch. Old scan software, maybe some corrupted pixels. Don't let it get to you. But Alice couldn't let it go. That night, she brought a copy of the image home on a flash drive. She told herself it was for further study, but deep down she knew it was more than that. The photograph had become an obsession, a whisper that followed her, a question she couldn't stop asking. She loaded it onto her laptop, dimmed the lights, and stared. The longer she looked, the more details she thought she could see, the faint outlines of the children's shoes, the reflection of light in their eyes. But then something else, a flicker. A movement so slight she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. The girl in front, the sixth child, had shifted. Her head, which had been tilted slightly downward, was now angled toward the camera. Alice's pulse roared in her ears. She reached out as if to close the laptop, but froze when she realized what she was hearing. A faint sound. Not from the computer speakers, but from behind her. A slow, deliberate click, like the winding of a camera shutter. She turned. The room was empty. Only the faint reflection of her own silhouette stared back from the darkened window. She didn't notice until later that on her desk, beside the laptop, lay a small smear of damp soil, just enough to stain the corner of a page. And when she looked back at the screen, the photograph had changed one final time. Now, in the bottom margin of the image, just beneath the row of children, someone had written in faint brown script, "We are not gone." The next morning, Alice arrived at the museum feeling as though she had not slept at all. Her dreams had been haunted by the photograph, the sixth child shifting, her half-open eyes, the faint message in the margin. She had tried to rationalize it, an overactive imagination, a digital artifact, but reason offered little comfort. The more she examined the photo, the less ordinary it became. Determined to find answers, she returned to Dr. Hale. He was still sipping his morning tea, surrounded by stacks of Victorian ledgers, catalogs, and the faint aroma of ink and dust. Alice placed the photograph before him, along with her notes. Hale adjusted his glasses and studied the print quietly. "I see why you're unsettled," he said finally. "This is not a typical family portrait. Not even a typical death portrait." "I want to know who she is," Alice said. "The sixth child. The one seated in front. She's not in any of the census records. There's no death record under the Eldridge name for anyone who would fit, but she was physically present." Hale nodded slowly. "Then we need to consider that she may have been someone else entirely. A child from another household, perhaps recently deceased, repurposed for this image." Alice's stomach turned. The thought was horrifying, but in a Victorian context, not impossible. She had read of mortuary photographers providing a final likeness of children for grieving families, but borrowing the body of a child who wasn't theirs? That was something she had never encountered. Hale leaned forward, flipping through his notes. "Check Dr. Mercer's patient logs," he said. He was the local physician at the time. He kept meticulous records of illnesses, fevers, deaths, and sometimes he handled delicate matters quietly. Alice returned to the archive. Mercer's ledgers were handwritten in a looping, precise script, the ink faded but legible. She scanned pages for Norfolk entries in 1899, the year of the photograph. Most were mundane, fevers, colds, routine home visits. But then she found something unusual. April 27, 1899. Patient, Clara M., age 5. Pneumonia, declining. Mother, Margaret M., advised comfort care. Limited prognosis. Body unclaimed. Parochial notice sent. Alice froze. Clara M. was not an Eldridge. She had never appeared in census records for the area beyond this brief mention. She appeared, in Mercer's logs, as a child who had already died. Her heart pounded as she continued reading. Another note, dated April 28th. Deceased. Body available for disposition. Family did not claim. Consideration. Photographic record possible for private client if requested. Alice stared at the words. It was explicit. Mercer had recorded the death of a child who had no family present to claim her body. And the ledger's margin contained a faint annotation in a different hand. Arrangement confirmed with Corvin and Sons. Delivery to Eldridge household. One day only. Her fingers trembled as she traced the words. Delivery. One day. The implications were staggering. The child in the photograph, the sixth, the seated one, was Clara M., borrowed after her death to appear as part of the Eldridge family. She had been placed among the living, carefully propped with a posing stand, and photographed to create the illusion of her survival. Alice leaned back in her chair, trying to comprehend the mechanics of it. The Eldridges had 5 children. One child died unexpectedly, or perhaps had already passed. Mercer had quietly arranged with the mortuary photographers to bring in another deceased child, substituting her likeness for one of the family. For what purpose? Alice's mind raced. In Victorian England, inheritance laws often dictated that children must survive a parent or uncle to receive their portion of an estate. Could this have been a scheme to preserve an inheritance? Or perhaps to satisfy some social obligation? A mourning photograph, a visual record for the family or the parish? But why had the image been staged in the backyard rather than the studio? Why no mourning attire? Why the artificial lamplight and deliberate separation from the other children? Alice re-examined the photograph on the monitor. The living children, Henry, Clara, Edith, Samuel, Beatrice, stood slightly apart, their feet angled away, their hands hidden behind their backs or resting stiffly at their sides. They did not touch her. Not even the smallest gesture of comfort. It was as if they had been told, do not look, do not touch, do not speak. The thought chilled Alice to the bone. In a home full of grief, the children were being coerced to perform obedience, to maintain the illusion of life in the presence of a corpse. She printed a copy of the ledger page and placed it beside the photograph. The juxtaposition made the horror unmistakable. The child who had lived was gone. The child who had died was posed, borrowed, and used. The photograph was not merely a keepsake, it was a tool of deception. Alice stared at the image long into the night, tracing the outline of Clara M.'s small, stiff hands. Her eyes, half closed in the photograph, seemed almost to plead for recognition, as though she knew that the truth would one day be uncovered. In the quiet of the museum, surrounded by centuries of preserved history, Alice whispered to herself, "Who are you, child without a name? And why did we let them stand you among the living?" For the first time, she realized that the photograph was not silent. It spoke, not in words, but in absence, in stillness, and in the faint, haunting echo of a life repurposed. Alice could not stop thinking about the ledger entries. The dead child, Clara, had been delivered, posed, and photographed as part of a living family, treated not as a person but as a prop. The realization gnawed at her. This was not mere post-mortem portraiture, which often carried a sense of mourning, of love preserved. This was deliberate substitution, an act that blurred the line between grief and deception, life and performance. Back in the conservation lab, she met with Naomi again. Together, they examined the high-resolution scans. The metal posing stand behind Clara's back was unmistakable, but what unsettled Alice more was the dress. The gown was slightly too large, and the shoes didn't match, a detail that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not scrutinizing the image at full magnification. "Do you see this?" Alice whispered, pointing at the cuffs. The tag, hand-stitched initials. CK. Naomi frowned. CK? That's not an Eldridge initial. Clara's maybe? Yes, Alice said, her voice trembling. Clara Mercer, or Clara, in the ledger. She wasn't an Eldridge. She was someone else entirely. Naomi swallowed. So, they brought a dead child into another family's photo? That's grotesque. Alice nodded slowly. Yes. But it wasn't grotesque for the sake of horror. There's a motive here. Something practical, calculated. She returned to the ledger. Mercer's notes were meticulous. Each entry revealed a precise timeline: the original child's death, the delivery of Clara M., the photographic session, and the recording of the image's placement, all designed to create the illusion of life. The entry even specified that the session was to be conducted in the family's backyard after sunset, under lamplight, to ensure no witnesses and no casual observers. Alice realized something deeper. This was not a simple death photograph. It was an orchestrated deception. The living children had been instructed to behave carefully, stand apart, avoid touching, maintain a rigid posture. Their obedience was a crucial part of the ruse. And yet, in the middle of all this precision, one detail stood out. The child's body, borrowed from another family entirely, had been treated with an eerie tenderness. Her gown was smoothed, her hair carefully combed, her hands folded as if she were merely asleep. Mercer had not hurried through the session. He had taken care to present her as convincingly alive as possible. Alice's stomach twisted. The act was practical, yes, but also intensely personal. It was almost as if Mercer, in orchestrating this deception, was claiming something for himself. Perhaps he had never had a photograph of his own child. Perhaps the act of positioning Clara M., borrowing her presence, was an attempt to create an image of life he had never truly held. The implications were horrifying. A child's body had been repurposed for the ambitions of the living. Love, grief, and obsession had been twisted into something that looked like a family portrait but was, in fact, a document of control and appropriation. Alice leaned back and stared at the image again. The living children, obedient and silent, seemed almost to recoil from the girls seated among them. Her eyes were closed, yet the stillness of her posture, the unnatural rigidity of her body, spoke volumes. They had known she was not alive. They had been instructed to treat her as if she were a presence that could not be acknowledged. She printed a second copy, this time using a magnified resolution to highlight the small details: the misaligned shoes, the oversized dress, the faint gleam of the metal stand. Each detail was a testament to the meticulous orchestration of the scene. Naomi leaned over her shoulder. "It's almost ceremonial, isn't it? Not just practical, but ritualized." Alice nodded grimly. "Exactly. And the ritual is horrifying because it's grounded in reality. This isn't supernatural. There's no magic here, just planning, timing, and a complete disregard for the dead child's individuality. She was substituted for a purpose." A thought struck Alice then, one that made her shiver. "And the family," she whispered, "they participated. They obeyed. The living children played their part in this charade, and no one outside that house would have known." Naomi swallowed hard. "So it was all for appearances?" "Yes," Alice said, her voice low. "Appearances. Maybe inheritance. Maybe social obligation. Maybe something as simple as wanting a photograph of the family, complete. But at what cost? A child without a name, without a voice, used to make the world believe what it was not." The quiet of the conservation lab seemed to press against her. Alice realized that she could never unsee the image, never separate the girl from the photograph. Clara, borrowed flesh, meticulously posed, utterly silent, was a presence that demanded acknowledgement, even if the world had long ago forgotten her. And somewhere in the shadows of history, Alice felt, the girl was still waiting for someone to finally see her, not as a tool or a prop, but as what she had truly been, a child. The discovery of Clara M.'s ledger entry left Alice with a gnawing unease, but it also demanded a new line of inquiry. If the child had been borrowed for a photograph, there must have been a reason beyond mere convenience or cruelty. She turned next to the Eldridge family records, probate files, and local archives, piecing together the legal and financial context of 1899 Norfolk. The Eldridges were modest farmers, yet they had recently inherited property from Thomas Eldridge's brother, a man who had died childless the previous year. The estate was small but valuable, consisting of farmland and a timbered cottage. Alice discovered the key detail buried in the will. The estate was to be divided among the children only if all were alive at the time of execution, or else their share would revert to the next eligible relative in Shropshire, several counties away. Alice felt a chill. The instructions weren't unusual in themselves. Conditional inheritance clauses were common. But now the photograph took on a different meaning. The sixth child, the one seated in the photograph, had been positioned carefully, placed among the living siblings, the day before a probate officer would assess the property and confirm the surviving heirs. She returned to Mercer's ledger for confirmation. There was, written in faint ink, "Arrangement confirmed, Eldridge children to be photographed in full. 1 day prior to estate assessment. Ensure all 6 present. Private session." The timing was precise. The photograph wasn't a tribute to a lost child, it was evidence. A visual record to satisfy the will's requirement that all heirs were alive. The living children's stiffness and avoidance of the seated girl made sense now. They had been instructed not to interact with her, maintaining the illusion that she belonged. Alice documented the sequence in her notes. Original sixth child, unknown or deceased, was unaccounted for in census records. Clara M., deceased, was borrowed post-mortem by Mercer. Photographs staged in the backyard after dark to avoid witnesses. Children arranged meticulously to prevent suspicion. Image presented as proof of all 6 children surviving the date of inheritance assessment. She leaned back in her chair, stunned by the cold practicality of it. In a single photograph, a family had manipulated reality, exploited a dead child, and bent the living to their will, all for legal and financial gain. The next revelation came from an unexpected source: local parish records. Alice discovered a faint annotation in the Eldridge Register noting an unusual consultation with Dr. Mercer just days before the photograph. Eldridge household, all children present for photographic recording as required by probate clause. Unverified by church officials. The probate office had relied on Mercer's confirmation of the photograph, not on physical attendance of each child. No one questioned the sixth child. No one noticed that she was not one of the Eldridges at all. Alice realized the genius and the horror of the scheme. The deceased child had been positioned among the living purely to serve as legal proof, while the real sixth child may have been unavailable, ill, or even deceased. The family's greed had turned a moment of mourning into a calculated, almost industrial act of deception. She also found a curious footnote in the ledger regarding the photographer. Corvin and Sons to maintain confidentiality. Session to be conducted privately. No public studio involvement. Corvin and Sons, long defunct, had specialized in post-mortem portraiture but were also known, according to an old trade directory, for discreetly supplying photographic evidence for private matters of inheritance and legacy disputes. Alice shivered. The more she uncovered, the more she realized how deliberate this had been. This was not a simple case of a grieving family trying to preserve memory. It was a carefully orchestrated act of survival and gain, leveraging death, illusion, and obedience to satisfy a will's technicality. She studied the living children in the photograph once more. Their faces, tense and awkward, now carried an additional weight. They were complicit in a silent deception, trained to perform a charade without understanding its purpose. They had been instructed to act, and they had obeyed, the way children always did in Victorian households. And at the center, the borrowed child, Clara M., sat as the unwitting keystone of the plan, a fragile body transformed into a tool, a prop, and a witness to a lie that was legally binding. Alice wrote in her journal that night. The photograph was never meant to be a memory. It was a document, an instrument of inheritance. Life and death were subordinated to law, money, and control. The child without a name became the proof of survival that the living could not provide themselves. The revelation left her shaken, but it also clarified the grim logic of the past. Where she had once seen horror without purpose, she now saw horror with motive. And the child, silent and still, remained at the center of it all, unseen, unheard, yet pivotal. Alice knew that uncovering this truth was only the beginning. Understanding the motive revealed not only the cold calculation of a Victorian family but also the profound moral distortion that allowed a human being, even a child, to be repurposed for gain. The photograph, she realized, spoke a language of practical horror, one that transcended time, forcing the living to confront what the dead had silently endured. Alice left the archive that evening with a sense of heavy resolution. The Eldridge photograph, once a curiosity tucked in the museum's digital vault, had revealed its full story, a meticulous orchestration of death, deception, and survival, all bound by Victorian legalities. But understanding the mechanics did not ease the weight of what she had uncovered. The image lingered in her mind, its pale eyes staring back with the accusatory quiet of centuries-old stillness. Back at home, she spread out her notes on the dining table, the ledger entries, probate clauses, coroner's reports, and high-resolution scans. Each piece fit together like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a grotesque, impossible truth. A child's body had been borrowed posthumously, posed among strangers, and photographed to satisfy the technical requirements of inheritance. The living children had obeyed, silent participants in a charade they would never fully comprehend. The dead child, Clara M., had become a tool, a witness to a lie. Alice leaned back in her chair and considered the moral implications. In a modern context, the act was abhorrent, an unimaginable violation of ethics and the sanctity of life. But in 1899, Victorian society placed legal and social obligations above individual suffering in many ways. Families often prioritized status, property, and appearances. Still, that did not make the act less chilling. The girl had no voice. She had no recognition. And yet, through the photograph, she endured a silent, haunting presence, bridging life and death, time and memory. The next day at the museum, Alice presented her findings to Dr. Hale and Naomi. She had prepared a report detailing the timeline, the death of the unrecorded Eldridge child, the delivery of Clara M., the precise staging, and the photograph's role in securing the estate. Hale listened quietly, occasionally interjecting with technical clarifications, but his expression grew increasingly somber. "It's remarkable," he said finally, "how law, grief, and opportunity intersected here. A child repurposed, yes, but not maliciously in the usual sense. It was necessity, or perhaps desperation, framed within the strictures of inheritance law." Alice nodded. "But does necessity excuse it? The living children were complicit, unwittingly. And Clara, what she endured, she had no choice." Naomi looked at the scans once more. "And yet she remains, in a way. Her presence is preserved forever in the photograph. Maybe that is her voice, after all, the image itself." Alice thought about this. The photograph had become both evidence and memorial. Unlike the unclaimed ledger entries, Clara was visible, acknowledged in silence. Her borrowed life had been transformed into a permanent record, one that could now be studied, understood, and remembered. Weeks later, Alice submitted her report to the museum's director and the editorial board of the Journal of Victorian Material Culture. The publication triggered a quiet storm of fascination among scholars, debates over ethics, Victorian social mores, and the intersection of death, photography, and law. Researchers were captivated not only by the morbid ingenuity of the photograph but by the moral ambiguity it presented. Alice never sought the public spotlight. She declined interviews, ignored television requests, and never posted the story online. The discovery was too intimate, too human, too uncomfortable for sensationalism. Instead, she documented everything meticulously in the museum's internal archives, ensuring that future researchers could study the photograph with full knowledge of its context. In her private journal, she wrote, "The photograph is a testament not just to death or deception, but to human complexity. We often assume morality is binary, but history reminds us it is layered, difficult, and sometimes cruel. The question is not always who lied, but who acted in the only way they believed possible. The child without a name remains with us, silent yet present, a reminder of what can be lost and found through the lens of history." Months later, when Alice returned to the archive for a routine cataloging session, she passed the shelf where the leather-bound album rested. She paused, running her gloved hand along its spine. The photograph, now digitized and studied, remained locked in a protective folder, untouched by casual eyes. And yet, in the quiet of the museum, she felt the same presence she had felt the night she first examined it, the faint, almost imperceptible sensation that Clara, the child without a name, was still watching. Not with malice, but with quiet insistence. She existed as a bridge between worlds, life and death, history and memory, silence and recognition. Alice whispered softly, not expecting an answer. "You are seen now." The echo of her words seemed to linger in the dusty air, and for a moment, the museum felt impossibly still, as if it were listening. The photograph, once a secret tool of inheritance, had become something else entirely. It was a testament, a witness, and a warning that human lives, especially those without power, voice, or name, can be manipulated, yet never fully erased. And sometimes, the silent ones demand to be remembered long after their deaths, through the smallest of traces, a glance, a shadow, a borrowed photograph, speaking across a century. In that silence, Alice understood, the legacy of the child without a name was not just in the photograph, but in the story it compelled others to see and acknowledge.